Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, Summer Session 2019. Here's our book, Introduction to World Philosophy, a multicultural reader. We are going over Zhuangzi, the Chinese Daoist philosopher, in this video. And we will be going over exam 2 questions, part A, number 1, and part B, number 3. So the first question for part A is, why does Zhuangzi call unity with the Tao obliterating? He talks about the obliterating unity with the Tao. So why does he call that obliterating, and what does that have to do with his concept of putting oneself in subjective relation with externals? That's a quote. And why does he suggest we do that? So you can see the quote about the obliterating unity of the Tao on page 327 at the bottom of the right-hand column. And he talks about putting yourself in subjective relation with externals at the right-hand column at the bottom of page 324. And he goes on to talk about that on page 325. At the bottom of the left-hand column and the top of the right-hand column. So I will just give an overview of his philosophy before I get into reading too many of the direct quotes from the book. So why does Zhuangzi call unity with the Tao obliterating, and what does that have to do with this concept of putting oneself in subjective relation with externals? We are going over, in this part of the class, it's part 3 of the book, and it is epistemology, the study of knowledge. How do we gain knowledge? Can we gain knowledge? What is knowledge? So Zhuangzi, as a Daoist, he comes to the conclusion that we can't adequately define our terms when we differentiate one thing from another, because who can find the absolute standard by which to define things? Some people will define justice, for example, one way. Others will say, no, that your concept of justice is completely unjust, and so they have completely opposite opinions. Who can decide? Where's the standard? But that doesn't mean he thinks there's no such thing as knowledge in itself, just that it can't be adequately explained, because he does recommend that we obliterate our differences in the unity of the Tao. So for him, the Tao is the source of everything. It's beyond space and time. It's the source of space and time. And when we see everything in the manifest world, which is governed by the rule of opposites, hot and cold, day and night, left wing, right wing, all these different pairs of opposites, that's what defines the material world that we live in, which is a miserable place, Zhuangzi points out. You work your whole life before you have time to enjoy the fruits of your labor. You die, you don't know where you're going to go. Isn't this a horrible situation? Am I the only one who sees how horrible this is? He says in this reading that we have. But then he says, so the wise person just takes refuge in realizing everything is united in this ultimate source of being, the Tao, and that you should stop trying to be argumentative to prove that you're right and another person's wrong. It's impossible to do it, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an absolute ordering principle. It's just that you can only enjoy that or realize it from a subjective point of view. So objective knowledge is the same as subjective knowledge because you are one with everything, so there's no difference between subjective and objective in the ultimate perspective of the Tao. And that's part of the question for putting yourself in subjective relation with the externals. So I see the world around me, I'm not the world around me, so therefore I can't understand it. But if I realize everything is rooted in the Tao, and I take the perspective of the Tao, now I can understand things. But all distinctions have been obliterated by that unifying realization, and now I can't use words which separate one thing from another, which categorize things in different categories. From this perspective, this obliterating perspective of unity with the Tao, words no longer apply. In the Tao Te Ching, by Lao Tzu, it begins by saying the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. So you can't express this in words. Well, then why are you using words to try to express it? So in this, usually in this class, especially with the book that we used prior to this one, I would begin to kind of help explain the language of the Daoists. I think Henri Bergson. So Henri Bergson, his philosophy, he breaks knowledge down into two types: analysis and intuition. And I think that is going to help us understand what Zhuangzi is talking about and what Plato is going to be talking about. So analysis is knowing things from the outside, analyzing them, like, if I want to analyze this bottle, okay, it's cylindrical, it's white, it's this many inches tall. I can look at it from all sorts of perspectives, from over here, underneath. I can weigh it. There's an infinite number of ways that I can analyze that any object from the outside, and he calls that analysis. And when you do that, you describe one thing using words, which are symbols or numbers, all of which apply to an infinite variety of things. So this is a cylinder. Well, there's an infinite number of cylinders that you could imagine. This is white. There's an infinite number of white things. Every word that you use to describe that can apply to this thing and an infinite number of other things. So what is this thing in itself that's unique and different from everything else? Words are not adequate to give that information, because words always compare one thing to a bunch of things that it isn't, that it's similar to, but is not them. So you can't have knowledge of a thing, pure absolute knowledge of what a thing is in itself, using symbols, using words, or using numbers, using analysis. Intuition, he says, is knowing something from within. I could only know this absolutely if I was this thing. So Bergson says, well, maybe I can't be one with this thing, but at least I can be one with myself, and I can know myself from within. And I can have absolute knowledge of that, immediate knowledge, but then I couldn't express it in words, because any words I use would apply to me and everyone else, or an infinite number of other kinds of people who are similar to me. So that's his point. Knowledge is achievable, but it cannot be expressed in symbolic language. Although he concludes by saying you can use symbolic language to zero in on a state of mind in which an intuition can be had. So it's not useless to use words, to use analysis to analyze things from every possible angle, but the ultimate goal is to trigger some intuition of the thing. Now, in the Daoist perspective, that is possible. Everything is rooted in the Tao. This little bottle is rooted in the Tao. This cup is rooted in the Tao. Everything is. So that is what Zhuangzi is recommending, that you engage in this obliterating unity of the Tao. It obliterates all distinctions between one thing and another. You become everything, and then you can know it immediately and directly. But then you wouldn't be able to express that knowledge in words, because words separate everything into categories. So I've gone over this a couple of times. That's the main idea, I think, to grasp from the text. And now I will just read some bits and pieces from this. The writing is by Zhuangzi, and it's called Zhuangzi. It starts on page 323, and it begins by saying, great knowledge embraces the whole, small knowledge a part only. Great speech is universal, small speech is particular. So right there, the whole versus the particulars. You can know the whole because you're one with the whole. But then when you want to break the whole into all its little bits and pieces, that's when all these distinctions and hierarchies and prejudices emerge. So knowledge of the whole is great knowledge, and small knowledge is of little things. So great meaning, it seems to me that this is a translation from an ancient text, but great not only meaning knowledge of what is big, but also this is the more important knowledge. And small knowledge meaning not only knowing what is the little bits of the whole, but also smaller in value. because it's prone towards contention and arguments. So that's just how it begins, and it's just saying, it's giving a prelude to the philosophy involved here. Focus on our unity with the whole, not on all the different bits and pieces that have their biased perspectives. So on page 324, on the left-hand column, the second paragraph, he says, joy and anger, sorrow and happiness, caution and remorse come upon us by turns. Come upon us by turns with ever-changing mood. They come like music from hollowness, like mushrooms from damp. Daily and nightly they alternate within us, but we cannot tell whence they spring. Can we then hope in a moment to lay our finger upon their very cause? All right, so these pairs of opposites, joy and anger, all these opposing emotions, they come and go, it's ever-changing. So where's the ground for true knowledge if we're just an ever-changing series of emotions? So he goes on to say, but for these emotions I should not be. But for me, they would have no scope. So without my emotions, I don't exist. If I don't exist, the emotions they can't activate. So far, we can go, but we do not know what it is that brings them into play. 'Twould seem to be a soul, but the clue as to its existence is wanting. That such a power operates is credible enough, though we cannot see its form. Perhaps it has functions without form. So he's saying, okay, I'm a living being with a lot of emotions. I'm moving around. So I probably have a soul, but I can't prove it. So he's a skeptic. This is for this whole part of the book, epistemology. What is knowledge? Can we have knowledge? So he's, in the Daoist, he's kind of uniting the opposite perspectives of, yes, we can have absolute knowledge, and yet he's also skeptic. He's a skeptic saying, I can't prove it. You know, I wouldn't be able to prove this with words, and yet there is some absolute state of mind to be achieved for which you should strive. So he's saying here, I think there's a soul, but I can't be sure. Then he says, take the human body with all its manifold divisions. Skipping down, he says, surely there is some soul which sways them all. You know, what's moving my body? There must be a soul. But then he goes on to say, but whether or not we ascertain what are the functions of the soul, it matters but little to the soul itself. For coming into existence with this mortal coil of mine, with the exhaustion of this mortal coil, its mandate will also be exhausted. So now I don't know for sure, what is he saying? That the soul is born and it dies just like the body. It's not an eternal soul. He says, I don't know, at the very bottom of that left-hand column. To labor without ceasing, and then without living to enjoy the fruit, worn out, to depart suddenly, one knows not whither. Is not that a just cause for grief? So we don't know what's going to happen, is what he's saying. What advantage is there in what men call not dying? The body decomposes and the mind goes with it. This is our real cause for sorrow. Can the world be so dull as not to see this? Or is it I alone who am dull and others not so? All right, so life is hard. You suffer your whole life and then you die, and you don't know what's going to happen after you die. That's what he's saying there. It seems like there's a soul, but what is a soul? Does it live after your body? I don't know. So there's the skepticism aspect. And yet he will talk about the superior person as a spiritual being who merges with the Tao beyond the heavens. And so that's very similar to the Upanishads, as I'll point out. So again, he's kind of uniting the opposites. He's a skeptic, yet he believes there's absolute knowledge to be had, but it just can't be proven in the normal way using terms, using words. So continuing on 324, the right-hand column, halfway down, he says, Tao is obscured by our want of grasp. Speech is obscured by the gloss of this world. Hence, the affirmatives and negatives of the Confucian and Maoist schools, each denying what the other affirmed and affirming what the other denied. But he who would reconcile affirmative with negative and negative with affirmative must do so by the light of nature. All right, so these two schools of philosophy, the Confucian and Maoist schools, you can take any polarity of philosophies and apply it here. You can say any, left wing and right wing, however you define them in whatever country they appear throughout history. He's saying, but he who would reconcile affirmative with negative and negative with affirmative must do so by the light of nature. How could you reconcile these warring factions? The light of nature. That's another word for the Tao, the origin, the source of being. We saw Plato used the same language, depicting Socrates using the same language in the Phaedo when he was in prison awaiting to die. And he was talking about you can have absolute knowledge, using the pure light that is everywhere. I'll just go there. 253 in our book, page 253. And he says, he says, you can only attain knowledge of the absolute ideas in which everything is rooted after you die, by the very light of truth he's talking about. So he says on the right-hand column of page 252, well, but there's another thing, Simmias. Is there or is there not an absolute justice? Assuredly there is, and an absolute beauty and an absolute good, of course. But did you ever behold any of them with your eyes? No, I didn't. And all the other absolutes, greatness, health, strength, the essence of everything, he's saying. You can't see them when your mind is clouded by your bodily desires. So he goes on to say, and he attains to the knowledge of them in their highest purity, who goes to each of them with the mind alone. He doesn't allow, when in the act of thought, the intrusion or introduction of sight or any other sense in the company of reason, but with the very light of the mind in her clearness, he penetrates into the very light of truth in each. So over on the right-hand column, he's saying when the soul is alone and free from the body, then will be pure and converse with other pure souls. We ourselves will know the clear light everywhere, the light of truth. And then we saw in the next dialogue from Plato, the Pheadrus, that after you die, your soul travels to the outermost sphere of the universe, the outermost, standing on the outside of the vault of heaven, you can perceive the absolute ideas like justice and temperance and knowledge absolute, he says. And that recollection of those absolute ideas that you perceive after death and before your previous birth, that is where Plato roots knowledge. Knowledge is remembering the absolute forms that you perceived at the outermost horizon of the universe in between material bodies. So coming back to Zhuangzi, I mention that because he's going to use very similar language about uniting with the Tao, specifically at the outermost boundary and the centralmost point of the universe. So back on page 324, if you want to reconcile these opposing philosophical perspectives, you have to do so by the light of nature. The light of nature is the Tao. It's the source of everything. So continuing here, this next paragraph on the bottom of the right-hand column on page 324 is a pretty important one for understanding this Daoist philosophy, and it goes over to the next page, so I'll just continue reading and I'll probably break it up a little bit. So there is nothing which is not objective, there is nothing which is not subjective, but it is impossible to start from the objective. Only from subjective knowledge is it possible to proceed to objective knowledge. All right, so everything is objective and everything is subjective. The subject means the perceiving person, the active agent. That's the subject. In a sentence, I am walking. I is the subject. Am walking is called the predicate. And everything that's not me is an object. So if it's not a subject, for me, it's an object. For me, another person is an object. Using this kind of language, that from that person's perspective, they're a subject and I'm an object. So he's saying here, there's nothing which is not objective, there's nothing which is not subjective, but it is impossible to start from the objective. You have to start from your own subjective perspective, and then you realize ultimately that everything is subjective and objective because every perceiving subject is united in the Tao with every object to be known. That's the obliterating unity of the Tao, which is part of this exam question. So I'm going to continue to read here. He says, hence it has been said, the objective emanates from the subjective. The subjective is consequent upon the objective. This is the alternation theory. Nevertheless, when one is born, the other dies. When one is possible, the other is impossible. When one is affirmative, the other is negative, which being the case, the true sage rejects all distinctions of this and that. He takes his refuge in Tao and places himself in subjective relation with all things. Okay, so let me go back to these questions. Part A, question 1 for exam 2. Why does Zhuangzi call unity with the Tao obliterating? What does it have to do with this concept of putting oneself in subjective relation with externals? Why does he suggest we do that? Okay, so that right-hand column, the bottom paragraph there, one of the reasons he suggests that we obliterate the illusion of difference from everything else is to help us reconcile affirmative with negative and negative with affirmative, which we saw on page 324. So, for example, in the United States of America, there's the constant battle between left-wing and right-wing ideologies. Oh, and people say, how are we going to unify? We have to overcome this. Well, the Daoist philosopher Zhuangzi would say that you have to place yourself in a subjective relation with all things, each person. So if someone, a Daoist like Zhuangzi would not say, I'm a left-wing person or I'm a right-wing person. That would be as much as to say, I am not in harmony with the Tao. I have adopted only one side of things and I ignore the other. To show people the unity of everything, this how all ideologies are rooted in the same source, the Tao, then you can show people your perspective, although it appears to be opposite from the other person's perspective, really they're rooted in the same thing. And if you want to find the truth of both ideologies, you have to come back to that same ground of being. Well, where is that? And that's where he's going to go into some cosmology here. So when one is possible, the other is impossible. So this is back on page 324. He's talking about the alternation theory. When one is affirmative, the other is negative, which being the case, the true sage rejects all distinctions of this and that. He takes his refuge in Tao and places himself in subjective relation with all things. He's not going to take a side and join the bickering from one side, blaming everything on the other. That's why he suggests that we put ourselves in subjective relation with externals. Stop the bickering, increase the harmony. This is how you do it. So continuing on page 325, the top of the left-hand column, and inasmuch as the subjective is also objective and the objective also subjective, and as the contraries under each are indistinguishably blended, does it not become impossible for us to say whether subjective and objective really exist at all? So he's back now as a skeptic. Who's to say where the subjective begins and the objective begins? It's all dependent upon your perspective of things. So now, here's the cosmological part. When subjective and objective are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao. And when that axis passes through the center, at which all infinities converge, positive and negative alike blend into an infinite one. Hence it has been said that there is nothing like the light of nature. Okay, so in these videos I've been talking about the string theory, holographic string theory. So in academic cosmology, the evolution of physics went from Isaac Newton to general relativity, Isaac Newton's theory of gravity, to Einstein's theory of gravity, to quantum mechanics, the particle wave paradox, to string theory, which unites quantum mechanics and general relativity, specifically by saying that the universe is an expanding sphere which started in a point of infinite density, the singularity, which contained all space and time, and that furthermore, all space and time are contained at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, where space is expanding, from our perspective, on Earth at the speed of light. That the past, the present, and future are interwoven at each point of this outermost sphere, and then they radiate in on these fundamental strings to create the illusion, the hologram of three-dimensional objects evolving over time. So that cosmology is very similar to the cosmology that Plato described in the Pheadrus about between birth and death, going out to the outermost vaults of heaven, where you see the absolute ideas. We saw the same idea in the Upanishads, which I'll go back and read just a little bit on page 209, 208 and 209, and on page 212. So 208, this is from the Chandogya Upanishad. the left-hand column, he says, the intelligent whose body is spirit, whose form is light, whose thoughts are true, whose nature is like ether, omnipresent and invisible, from whom all works, all desires, all sweet odors and tastes proceed. He who embraces all this, who never speaks and is never surprised, he is myself within the heart, smaller than the small, but he's also greater than the great. If you look over at the Mundaka Upanishad, he's talking here about Brahman, who's compared to the syllable Om, and he says, in him the heaven, the earth, and the sky are woven, the mind also with all the senses. Know him alone as the self. And then a little bit later he says, he who understands all and who knows all, he to whom all this glory in the world belongs, the self, is placed in the ether, in the heavenly city of Brahman. So, and then on page 212, from the Taittiriya Upanishad, he says, he who knows Brahman, which is conscious, which is without end, as hidden in the depth of the heart, in the highest ether, he enjoys all blessings, at one with the omniscient Brahman. And then in the Katha Upanishad, the highest place of Vishnu is this outermost realm of the universe. So we see that same language in Zhuangzi when he's talking about the sage rejecting the distinctions that people place on everything, making things as objects different from themselves. So I'll read that again, and then I will read another related passage on the next page. So he says that when subjective and objective are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao. And when that axis passes through the center at which all infinities converge, positive and negative alike blend into an infinite one. Hence, it has been said that there's nothing like the light of nature. So that seems similar to me to the Big Bang cosmology. The center at which all infinities converge, the infinite one, the source of light, the source of everything, is this gravitational singularity, which then encompasses every point of the horizon, according to string theory. So continuing, skipping a paragraph, he says, so with the universe, all that in it is, these things are but fingers and horses in this sense. So that is related to the previous paragraph, but the possible is possible, the impossible is impossible. Tao operates and given results follow. Things receive names and are what they are. They achieve this by their natural affinity for what they are and their natural antagonism to what they are not. For all things have their own particular constitutions and potentialities. Nothing can exist without those. All right, everything's one, everything's united in the obliterating unity of the Tao, and now he's saying, on the other hand, all things have their own particular constitutions and potentialities. That seems very similar to Plato's theory in the Pheadrus, where the archetypes of justice and beauty and everything you could think of are to be seen. So for Plato's philosophy, what he would call the Tao, Plato calls the idea of the good. And all of the other absolute ideas are united in the idea of the good. Here it seems something like that, that these constitutions and potentialities that things have, these constitutional ways of being, these archetypal forms that the many material things follow, are all united in the Tao. So and he's talking about the universe. So he's just talked about the center at which all infinities converge, and he's specifically talking about the way the universe works. And so he is saying, on the one hand, it's one, everything is one in the Tao. On the other hand, everything is categorized according to its own constitutions and potentialities. And that's where the problem comes with giving an adequate definition of knowledge. Once you start distinguishing one thing from another, then you can no longer express the unity of everything. And so it's impossible to give an adequate explanation for the knowledge of the Tao using words, which, so I'm just going to continue to read here. So he says, therefore it is that, viewed from the standpoint of Tao, a beam and a pillar are identical, so are ugliness and beauty, greatness and wickedness. Nothing is subject either to construction or to destruction, for these conditions are brought together into one. Only the truly intelligent understand this principle of the identity of all things. They do not view things as apprehended by themselves, subjectively, but transfer themselves into the position of the things viewed. In viewing them thus, they are able to comprehend them, nay, to master them, and he who can master them is near. So it is that to place oneself in subjective relation with externals, without consciousness of their objectivity, this is Tao. But to wear out one's intellect in an obstinate adherence to the individuality of things, not recognizing the fact that all things are one, this is called 3 in the morning. Okay, so now we're going to get into question number 3 for part B. What is Zhuangzi's 3 in the morning parable intended to teach? So here's the story. What is 3 in the morning, asks Z.U. This is page 325, the right-hand column. A keeper of monkeys, replied Z.Ki, said with regard to their rations of chestnuts that each monkey was to have 3 in the morning and 4 at night. But at this the monkeys were very angry, so the keeper said they might have 4 in the morning and 3 at night, with which arrangement they were all well pleased. The actual number of the chestnuts remained the same, but there was an adaptation to the likes and dislikes of those concerned, namely the monkeys. Such is the principle of putting oneself into subjective relation with externals. Okay, so the monkeys in the zoo were not happy to hear that they were going to get 3 chestnuts in the morning and 4 at night. They wanted more sooner. And I don't think it's an accident that the zookeeper is a human and the people who are not able to understand the unity of things are the monkeys. So it's kind of monkey consciousness. I want more now. That'll make them happy. So that's putting oneself into subjective relation with the externals. Okay, they're going to get 7 chestnuts a day. What's the difference? Actually, I think the metaphor is kind of weak. I'd rather have 4 in the morning and 3 at night because you need more energy throughout the day and you don't want to be full and digest all night. But I don't think that was the point. The point is 3 and 4, 4 and 3, it comes out to 7. Why are you clamoring like a bunch of monkeys? But nevertheless, since it means something to you, I'll put myself in your position. Okay, I see your perspective, so what's the harm? Let's give you what you want. So such is the principle of putting oneself into subjective relation with externals, wherefore the true sage, while regarding contraries as identical, adapts himself to the laws of heaven. This is called following 2 courses at once. 2 courses. One is from the perspective of the Tao. Everything's obliterated in its unity with the Tao. On the other hand, most people don't see that. They see things as distinguished between this and that. So adapt yourself to the majority of people who do not relate everything back to its unifying source. It seems to be 3 in the morning. That's the 3 in the morning tactic. I know, here, if you're a kindergarten teacher or something like that, you know what is best, but the class has, they're set on having cupcakes at lunch and not at the end of the day. So, okay, just to avoid the situation, let's just give them what they want. It's something similar to that. On a higher level, I think in the political situation, you have to take into account the historical trends that have created the opinions of the majority of people. And even if they go against the knowledge of the unity of everything, you have to adjust yourself by seeing things from their perspective. Okay, they don't see it the way I see it. They're not seeing things united in the Tao. So how are they looking at it? How can I adjust? Living in 2 worlds. For Plato, we'll see later in the next part of the book, it's the cave allegory. Someone who's out of the cave sees the idea of the good. Nevertheless, they have to go back into the cave of the material world and adjust to the people there, which can be dangerous. They might want to kill you. But we'll get into that when we get into the metaphysics section of the book. So continuing here, this is called following 2 courses at once. Therefore, what the true sage aims at is the light which comes out of darkness. He does not view things as apprehended by himself subjectively, but transfers himself into the position of the things viewed. This is called using the light. So we talked about that, the light of nature, the Tao, the idea of the good for Plato, the ether for the Hindus in the Upanishads. We're one with that. It's in our heart, the smallest of all small seeds, like a mustard seed, and yet it's the outermost boundary of the universe itself. where the absolute ideas are all interwoven with Vishnu, according to the Katha Upanishad. So using the light is seeing yourself united with the infinite source of everything, and adapting to others by putting yourself in their perspective. Walk in their shoes for a while. That's a Daoist idea. So it's similar, I think, to the Christian ethic. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart and soul and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Similar to realize you're one with the Tao, and therefore love your neighbor as yourself, because you are your neighbor at the most fundamental level. So then he goes on to say, there remains, however, speech. Is that to be enrolled under either category of contraries or not? All right, speech. We talked about at the beginning of this video Henri Bergson's two forms of knowledge, analysis and intuition. Analysis uses symbolic language to describe things, but a symbol always applies to an infinite variety of things. Blue, pen. The word blue applies to the sky. It applies to all sorts of this shirt. An infinite, endless number of things can be blue. There's trillions of pens. If there's a megaverse of universes, then there's an infinite number of pens on parallel universes. You can't define what a thing is using words, because you're always comparing what it is to things that it isn't. You have to become the thing itself to know what it truly is, but then you wouldn't be able to express that knowledge in words, because words inherently categorize things. So I've been over that. So he brings up the question of speech. There remains, however, speech. The next paragraph, if then all things are one, what room is there for speech? On the other hand, since I can utter these words, how can speech not exist? All right, so and we addressed that too. Speech can't give you a definition of absolute knowledge, but it can prepare your mind for an intuition to occur. It can instigate a desire to have that intuition. It can point the way, but it can never itself express the unity of the Tao adequately, because words inherently divide things into categories. So hence, if from nothing you can proceed to something and subsequently reach three. All right, anyway, to avoid such, he's referring to the infinite regress. How do you explain this? Where does the universe come from? The Big Bang. Oh, the singularity. Where did that come from? All right, well, now you're in an infinite regress. He says, to avoid such progression, you must put yourself into subjective relation with the external, which again was part of the exam question for part A. So now I am going to read a little bit more that I think will help elaborate on what we've gone over, but we have covered everything in the exam question. So let me just read this again. So part A, question 1, why does Zhuangzi call unity with the Tao obliterating? What does that have to do with his concept of putting oneself in subjective relation with externals? And why does he suggest we do that? So that's it's a lot in there, because it's all related. He suggests we put ourselves in subjective relation with externals because he wants to get away from the bickering argumentativeness of saying, I'm right and you're wrong. Well, what's your standard of right and wrong? What's your criteria? It can't be decided, he's saying. So you can't use words to describe externals adequately and in a complete way, so therefore become the external. Put yourself in subjective relation with the external just means see things from within that external person or object's perspective. Well, how do you do that? You realize that everything is already united in the Tao. And that is on page 327. He says, we are embraced in the obliterating unity of Tao. There is perfect adaptation to whatever may eventuate, and so we complete our allotted span. But what is it to be embraced in the obliterating unity of Tao? It is, so, overcoming the pairs of opposites is to be embraced in the obliterating unity of the Tao. On page 327, this is on the right-hand column. That's the bottom of the right-hand column is where you find the obliterating unity of the Tao phrase, and on page 328 he goes on to say, Take no heed of time, nor of right and wrong, but passing into the realm of the infinite, take your final rest therein. That's the obliterating unity of the Tao, passing into the realm of the infinite. And what does it mean to pass into the realm of the infinite? Again, it's very similar to the Upanishads' idea of the ether, the outermost encompassing sphere of the universe, which Plato talks about in the Pheadrus. Here on the bottom of page 326, the right-hand column, we're going to see a very similar image to this cosmic horizon. So the very bottom of the right-hand column, page 326, over to page 327, he says, "The perfect man," answered Zhuangzi, "is a spiritual being. Were the ocean itself scorched up, he would not feel hot. Were the Milky Way frozen hard, he would not feel cold. Were the mountains to be riven with thunder, and the great deep to be thrown up by storm, he would not tremble. In such case, he would mount upon the clouds of heaven, and driving the sun and moon before him, would pass beyond the limits of this external world, where death and life have no more victory over man. How much less what is bad for him?" So, mount upon the clouds of heaven and drive the sun and moon before him. There we are. This is the cosmic horizon. That's the beyond the limits of this external world, this material, empirically observable world that can be perceived by the sense organs. If you go to the limit of that, which is the horizon of the cosmos, that's where the perfect man, a spiritual being, goes. That's where you find the obliterating unity of the Tao, which is exactly what Plato depicted Socrates saying in the Pheadrus. So continuing on page 327, left-hand column, he says, "How does the sage seat himself by the sun and moon and hold the universe in his grasp? He blends everything into one harmonious whole, rejecting the confusion of this and that. Rank and precedence, which the vulgar prize, the sage stolidly ignores. The revolutions of 10,000 years leave his unity unscathed. The universe itself may pass away, but he will flourish still." And then he goes into talk about that this world might be a dream. We don't know what death is. Why should we lament? Because we're not sure. Maybe death is like awakening from a great dream. So here's his metaphor, the bottom of the left-hand column, 327. "The lady Li Ji was the daughter of Ai Fang." So I'm hoping I'm at least approximating the appropriate pronunciation here. "So when the Duke of Jin first got her, she wept until the bosom of her dress was drenched with tears. But when she came to the royal residence and lived with the Duke and ate rich food, she repented of having wept. How then do I know that the dead repent of having previously clung to life?" So this lady, she was going to get married. She wept. She didn't want to leave her home, didn't want to leave her family. But then when she got there, oh, this is an even better life. What a fool I was for crying. So then he goes on to compare this life to a dream. We don't know. Maybe death is like waking from a dream. So those who dream of the banquet wake to lamentation and sorrow. Those who dream of lamentation and sorrow wake to join the hunt. So that's a happy thing, according to this text. While they dream, they do not know that they dream. Some will even interpret the very dream they are dreaming, and only when they awake do they know it was a dream. By and by comes the great awakening. And then we find out that this life is really a great dream. So this is an important claim here. He says he doesn't know anything, and yet this is a very big claim of knowledge. To know that this world is a dream is claiming something. Fools think that they are awake now and flatter themselves they know if they are really princes or peasants. Confucius and you are both dreams, and I who say you are dreams, I am but a dream myself. This is a paradox. And then, so we live in a dream. So things in a dream, if you take the dream as reality, then you don't realize, oh, all of these dream figures are generated from the dreamer. That's the obliterating unity of the Tao. You can dream of a bunch of characters, but they're all united in the fact that they're emerging in your mind. Now you could say, well, just because they're in your dream doesn't mean you created them. There might be an objective reality to the characters who emerge in your dreams, like Carl Jung would say, these archetypes, the archetypal figures, the absolute ideas can manifest in your dream. But at any rate, that's something to consider. But the claim that there is a great awakening by and by comes the Great Awakening. It seems like he's talking about death there. When you die, it's the Great Awakening. He'll go on page 327 to say, who shall I employ as arbiter between us? If I employ someone who takes your view, he will side with you, and vice versa. So again, there's no absolute standards that are explainable in words that we can refer to solve arguments between two opposing parties. So since that's impossible, he says, since then you and I and man cannot decide, must we not depend upon another? Such dependence is as though it were not dependence. We are embraced in the obliterating unity of Tao. There is perfect adaptation to whatever may eventuate, and so we complete our allotted span. So to overcome the contentions between opposing opinions, realize that everyone is rooted in the obliterating unity of the Tao, and the obliterating unity of the Tao is found on page 325. It's described this way: when subjective and objective are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao, and when that axis passes through the center at which all infinities converge, positive and negative alike blend into an infinite one. Hence it has been said that there's nothing like the light of nature. So that's like the gravitational singularity, if we want to use a metaphor from modern cosmology, the center at which all infinities converge. That's the very axis of Tao. Okay, there's the central point of the spherical universe, and then over on page 327, the perfect man is a spiritual being. He would not feel hot or cold if the whole Milky Way was to freeze up. Nothing could make him tremble. In such case, he would mount upon the clouds of heaven, and driving the sun and moon before him, would pass beyond the limits of this external world, where death and life have no more victory over him. Okay, so that's another way to merge with the obliterating unity of the Tao, and the centralmost point in which all infinities converge, and then at the boundary of the universe, where beyond the limits of the external. That is, again, I think it's just helpful to keep in mind this holographic string theory, the ether philosophy of the Upanishads, and Plato's Pheadrus. And then I'll conclude this review of Zhuangzi with the most famous part of it, the right-hand column on page 328. Here's the final paragraph. He says, once upon a time I, Zhuangzi, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awaked, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man, dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly, dreaming I am a man. So there's the Daoist perspective on knowledge. It's impossible to even tell if we're dreaming or not. You can't use words to adequately express your opinions because other people could use other words and other standards of truth to express theirs, and there's no way that we could decide who's an appropriate arbiter of the truth. So the superior person, the perfect sage, just obliterates all these differences and sees everything united in the Tao, which we saw is specifically identified with the center at which all infinities converge and the outermost heaven beyond the limits of the external. Okay, so that should cover it for Zhuangzi.